Hello coders, this is Jared with Renaissance Coders, and in this video we are going to create a new animation cutscene in Unity 3D 2017.1 using the new Timeline and CineMachine tools. Now we are really excited about these new features in Unity 3D, and we have been testing out these new tools quite extensively, so we honestly have to say that they are pretty awesome and capable of creating a lot of different effects and extending our games in Unity 3D. Now for this tutorial we are going to focus on creating a quick 3D animation type of cutscene. Of course, we are going to be using both the Timeline and CineMachine tools to create this and some of the standard assets from Unity. The only real standard asset that I'm going to be using for this demo is the Fireworks prefab inside of the Particle Systems standard asset. So you may want to go ahead and pull in the Particle Systems standard asset as well. Also, I do want to point out that you will have to pull in CineMachine from the Asset Store. To find CineMachine on the Asset Store, all you have to do is go to your Asset Store tab, enter in CineMachine in your search bar, and you should come to this page, and all you have to do then is actually import it into your project. Okay, so if you haven't pulled in CineMachine, go ahead and do that now. So the first thing we're actually going to do is actually take a look at an example of what we will be creating in this video. Now this won't exactly reflect what we're going to be doing, but it's going to be pretty close to what we're actually going to create. So all I really need to do here is click my play button, and as we can see, we've just got some blocks moving towards the center. We've got some objects activating, as well as CineMachine cameras activating, before finally moving to a CineMachine camera in the center and just looking upwards. Alright, now let's go ahead and stop that. Okay, so this really is a pretty basic animation here, but we are really going to be focusing on using the Timeline and CineMachine for this tutorial, so strap in and get ready to learn. Okay, so the first thing I actually need to do is create a new scene. First I need to save my current scene, and I can just go to File, New Scene here, and now I've got a new scene set up, and as you can see, I've actually rearranged my window panels quite differently for this demonstration. I've got my project console and timeline down here on the bottom left. Next to that is my hierarchy, and then to the far right is the inspector, lighting, navigation, and services. We won't really need the lighting, navigation, or services for this tutorial, but I do like to keep these sort of docked together. And up top I've just got my scene and my game panels as well. Okay, so let's get started with a little bit of setup. We need to add several game objects to our scene to actually get the animations and stuff working. So inside of my hierarchy I'm going to just right click, create a 3D object that is a plane. Okay, so I actually want to change the positioning of my plane, so I'm going to set it to 0, 0, 0, and I'm going to change the scale in the X to 5 and the scale in the Z to 5. Now the next thing we actually need to create are a couple of cubes, so we're just going to right click, create a 3D object cube, and we are of course going to zero out the position of this again. Now if I focus up on this cube here, we can see that it's actually halfway through the floor. I don't want that, so I'm going to move it up 0.5 in the Y, which will actually put it on top or flush with our floor. Now I can actually go ahead and duplicate this out 3 times, 1, 2, 3. And now I actually want to add a few spheres into my scene as well, so I'm just going to go down, right click, create a 3D object sphere. And again, we're going to zero out the position, move it forward a little bit, and that's a little bit too big for my liking, so I'm going to drop it down to 0.5 as our scale. And what we actually want to do is add our prefab as a child of this, so I'm going to go to my standard assets, particle systems, prefabs, and just drag the fireworks onto my sphere here. And now I can actually go ahead and duplicate this sphere. Again, we're just going to need 4 of them in total, so duplicate it 3 times. And to duplicate, I'm just using Command D on Mac. Okay, so that should cover most of the game objects that we actually need for this scene, but I do want to actually change the color of these a little bit. So if I go up to my assets folder, I already have a materials folder here with several basic materials. If I click on the blue here, we can just see that it's a standard material with a blue color added to it. I've got a floor material that's just gray. So just go ahead and create a couple of materials with the colors that you like, and we can add them into our scene by just drag and drop like this. So my floor is going to be gray, my cubes are going to be blue, I'm also going to create a blue sphere, I'm going to have a green cube, so just drag green onto our sphere here. Well, that doesn't seem to want to take. I actually had the floor selected. Okay, if the material is not applying directly, we can click on it and then just drag that component like that. So now that we actually have our color set up, let's go ahead and work on the positioning of these objects. I don't really like the way they're currently positioned, so what I'm going to do is start with the cube and the sphere here, so the blue matching ones, and I'm going to set the X to -5, and as you can see, my rotation is a little bit off with my camera. There we go. So my X is now at -5, and I'm going to actually change the sphere to -6, so it's a little bit behind the cube. Now I'm going to select my green cube and my green sphere. I'm going to set it to a value of 5 in the Z. Of course, click on the sphere again and change it to 6 in the Z. Oh, the X is off on this one, so 0 out the X if it's a little off. 6 in the Z, so we should have the greens lining up over here. Very cool. Now let's just do the yellows. Again, we're going to go, so for this one, we're going to go -5. Oops, we're going to go 5 in the X, 0 in the Z. Click on our sphere here, and we're going to go -6 in the X and 0 in the Z again. Oops, make sure that's +6, not as -6. There we go. Now for the final one, which is our yellow, we're going to set this to a -5 in the Z, 0 in the X, and for our sphere, 0 out the X, and we're going to go -6 in the Z. So we should have them all pretty much lined up like that. That's how I want these actually lining up for our animation. Now, one thing you can do is if you go to your timeline, you can see that you can actually create a timeline with any game object in your scene. But I actually want to create an empty game object to hold this timeline. So I'm going to right click, create empty, and make sure it's not a child of anything. Zeroed out is pretty good. And I'm just going to call this my game manager. And now I can go ahead and actually create a timeline with this. So if I click on create now, we can see that I have a game manager timeline.playable. So this will probably be a new asset type for most of you coders who haven't used the timeline before. But if you have used the timeline before, then you would have already seen this. I do actually have a folder for my timelines as well. As you can see, I already have a game manager timeline set up here, so I'm actually going to change mine to game manager timeline 2, okay, and just save that. And as we can see up here, it's telling us which timeline we're currently working on, and we can see that we're working on an empty timeline as well. So what I'm actually going to do is increase the size of this a little bit. I can decrease the size of my inspector a little bit and the hierarchy, because we're not really going to be needing those a whole lot for this. I'm also going to go ahead and lock this panel on this timeline, and I'm doing that because if it's not locked and you click on a different object, you lose where you're currently at in the timeline editor, and that can get really frustrating. So it's just a lot easier to just sort of lock the panel when you're working on this specific timeline, or you're working on a timeline that will take a couple of minutes to complete. Okay, now the next thing I'm actually going to do inside of my timeline is I'm going to create a couple of track groups. So to do that, we can just right click track group, and a track group really just helps us to manage everything that's going into our timeline. So we're going to have 3 different types of assets that we're manipulating through this timeline. We're going to have the cubes, the spheres, and some CineMachine cameras that we have to update while we're actually going through this timeline. So this will help us to manage which assets we're currently working on. And I can actually give my track group's name. So I'm going to click on this one and just name it cubes. I'm going to create another one for my spheres. I'm going to create one final one for my cameras. We don't actually have cameras yet because we're going to set those up last. Now to add a game object to your timeline, you can just click and drag it in. And we're going to actually drag this in and create an animation track. Animation tracks allow us to manipulate things like scale, position, rotation. We're primarily going to be working on position updates for now because those are pretty easy and allow us to create some pretty cool animations really quickly. Now, as you can see, when I created that, it's not inside of my track group, but I can just easily drag it up, and now it should be inside of my track group here. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag all of these guys in and be sure to create them as animation tracks. So I've got my cube, cube 1, cube 2, and cube 3. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag these in like that. Now let's go ahead and actually start the position updates for these objects. To do that, I'm actually just going to click on this red button, which stands for like a record button. So we can see when we click that, our timeline goes red. It says we're recording. When I click on the object, go to my transform, I can actually click, and if I change the value, so from a -5, actually if I go -5 again, you can see that it's now recording, and it has actually created a keyframe here for us, which we want. We want it to start at this position, and then at frame 60, we're going to have it change to an X position of -1. Just like that. Okay, now we can actually stop recording here, and if I just pan through this, we can see that the cube is going to move over time. Another thing we can actually look at is there's like a little Bezier graph here. We can click on this, and this shows us how the update's going to take place. So we can see that this is like an ease in, ease out type of curve here, and you can change this if you want, but I'm not going to change it for this tutorial just because I kind of like the way the ease in and ease out actually looks here. So I'm going to toggle that down again, and I'm going to go ahead and click on my next cube. Make sure you're clicked on the correct cube here. Just enter a value of 5 for our Z, and then so 5 for our Z on the first frame, and then we're going to go to the 60th frame, and I'm going to do the same thing because I want these to actually move one at a time. So create another keyframe there, and now I'm going to go to frame 120, and I'm going to change the Z position to a value of 1. Okay, and again, stop recording here, and as I can see now, what's going to happen is our blue cube is going to move in, then our green cube is going to move in. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the updates for the other two. For the red cube, we're starting at a value of 5 in the X, so I can just easily at frame 1, enter 5 again, then at frame 20, make sure we're still at position 5, and then at frame 180 we're going to change that position to 1. Stop recording, start recording the next one, go to our next cube. So for our first frame we're going to have it at a position of -5. Now we're going to go to frame 180, make sure that we're still at -5, and now we're going to move out to frame 240, and we're going to change the Z position to a value of -1. So that should move all of our cubes towards the center. So I can stop recording this now, and I can actually go out and press play here, and this will just very quickly play this timeline for us. Okay, very cool. Now for our spheres, I actually want a different type of behavior to happen. I don't want to animate their positions. Instead, I want to actually activate them after the cube reaches the center position. So I'm just going to click on my cube, drag it in, and instead of creating an animation track, I'm going to create an activation track. And when I do that, we can see that it's saying it's going to be active all the way throughout. I don't want it to be active all the way throughout. I want it to start at frame 60, and we can actually change this in our clip timing over here in the inspector. As you can see, it's starting at frame 60, ending at frame 300. So I'm going to extend that out to frame 360. Very cool. So once the sphere reaches the center position, it will activate, which is what we want. Now for my next sphere, and actually I'm going to go ahead and drag this into my track group here for the spheres, and I can go ahead and actually toggle down the cubes track group because we don't really need it. And let's go ahead and set up our next sphere. So the next one's going to be sphere 1. I can just very easily drag it in, create an activation track, and we're going to go ahead and drag it out to start frame of 120, and we're going to reduce the end frame down to 360. Okay, and again, just drag it into our group, drag in the next one, activation track, drag it out to frame 180, and drop down the end position, and add it to our group again. Now for the last one, drag it in, activation track, we're going to drag it out to frame 240, and reduce the end time to 360 again, and add it to our track group again. Now let's go ahead and toggle this down, and as we can see, when I actually scroll through this, we can see that when the blue reaches its destination, the blue sphere actually turns on, then the green one turns on, the red one turns on, and the yellow one turns on. And then they just sort of hold their position, and they will continuously launch their particle systems. And we can, of course, press play again just to see it happen on its own rather than panning through. Okay, now the next thing we actually want to do is add in a couple of CineMachine cameras. Now, right now I've got my blocks moving in a clockwise pattern, so we're starting from the left and moving around to the bottom. So I'm actually going to have my CineMachine cameras set up in these far corners. So our first one's going to go here, second one here, third one over here, and fourth one down here. So let's go ahead and add those. I'm going to click on CineMachine up top and create a new virtual camera. And of course, I want to update the position of this guy. And we can see it in our hierarchy here. And it's really easy to actually guess the position here. So I need an X value of -10, and I'm going to need a Z value of 10. So that moves it into our camera, or into our corner, and now I'm going to give it a Y value of 10 as well. Currently, we don't actually have a target set for this guy though, so we can actually just go and look inside of our inspector, and we have a look at value here, so we can just drag in our first cube for our look at. Now we can also play with the focus method on this camera a little bit, and we can also play with the field of view if we want. We can zoom in or out. I kind of like the way that's positioned at 40 though. That looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and create our next camera. Again, just CineMachine, create a virtual camera. Gonna go to my camera. This time we're gonna have a positioning of 10 in the X, 10 in the Y, and 10 in the Z. We're gonna give it a look at of our cube 1, which should be our green cube here. And now we're gonna go ahead and do our next one, CineMachine, virtual camera again, click on it. This time we're gonna have an X value of 10, Y value of 10, Z value of -10. So if I rotate it, we should be seeing it above that corner there. We're going to give it a look target of our cube 2, which should be the red one. There we go. And now for the last one, again, just CineMachine, create virtual camera. This time we're going to have an X position of -10, Y value of 10, and Z position of -10 as well. Okay, and for our look at, we're going to look at our cube 3 here. Okay, so now if I actually scroll through this, we can see that we're focusing on this last camera, which is not really what I want. What I want is for my cameras to be activated when their block is moving. So right now my VCam1 is looking at our first cube, VCam2, second cube, and so on. So I want the VCam1 to be alive while our cube is actually moving, and then we'll transition to VCam2 while cube 1 is moving. So we can actually do activation tracks for these as well. So I'm going to go ahead and drag it in. I'm going to create an activation track here, and we only want this one active to frame 60. So I can easily drag this down to frame 60, and I can just drag it underneath my cameras here. Now for our next one, just going to create an activation track again. This time we're going to go to frame 120, and we're going to start at frame 60 again. Very cool. Now let's go ahead and add in our third one. Again, just an activation track. Start at frame 120, go to frame 180. And now for our last one, another activation track. We're going to start at 180, and we're going to go to frame 240. Okay, very cool. Now let's go ahead and actually move our virtual cameras into their respective groups. Very cool. And now if I actually press play, we should see something fairly interesting happening in our game scene. So right now we've got them all sort of changing and updating as we would like them to. Looks pretty good, but it doesn't look as good as it could look. Right now it looks like there's sort of a hard cut. And actually, if we want to see what it's actually going to look like, we could just press play here, and this will immediately fire our timeline. So here we go. We can see it moving. Okay, pretty cool, but I don't like the way that the cameras are actually blending together here. They look pretty cool the way it's actually blending and rotating around, but they don't look awesome. So what we're going to do is go to our main camera here, and if I scroll down, we can see that we have a CineMachine brain here. And we also have an update method, which is set to smart update, which is fine. I tested the other two methods out, but this one seems to work the best. But in our default blend, we have an ease in, ease out, cut, ease in, ease out, hard in, hard out, or linear. So I kind of like the ease in for this. We can also play with the time it takes in seconds to actually perform the transition. So I'm going to cut that in half and go down to 1. Now let's press play again and see how this looks. Okay, I definitely like the way that looks a little bit more. You know, it's pretty cool the way it's actually moving around to the camera that we want. But I do have one final update that I actually want to make. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new empty. I'm going to zero out the position, and I'm actually going to change the Y position to a value of, let's go with 15 here. And I'm going to create a new CineMachine virtual camera, and I'm going to leave this one positioned at 0. That should be fine, but I'm going to give it a look target of that new empty game object we just created, so it's looking like right up into the sky. But we do want to create an activation track for this one as well. So I'm going to go ahead, drag it in, create an activation track, and we're going to have it start at frame 240 and end at frame 360. And don't forget to actually drag it into your group as well. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this again. Again, I can pan through and sort of see what it's going to look like in my game panel over there. And as you can see, it actually cut pretty quickly to that last camera, but that may not be what it actually looks like in game mode. So let's go ahead and press play here to see what it actually looks like. So as we can see, the blue, green, red, yellow, now we're going to transition inside of the boxes. We're going to watch the fireworks for about a second and then go back to our first camera. So I'm not liking how long it takes, or how short of amount of time our camera actually spends inside of the cubes. Now to actually fix that, what I can do is lengthen out the active amount here. Just go to like frame 240, for example, and that will give us more time inside of the cubes. 1, 2, 3, 4, inside. Okay. I just realized another issue that we actually have here. So let's go ahead and stop this. The issue that we actually have is if we look at our spheres, they're not active as long as they need to be either. So we need to actually drag all of these guys out so that they're not cutting off early. So give us plenty of frames of particle system here. All right, now let's test it out one more time. Okay, looks pretty good. Inside. Okay, that looks pretty cool. I actually like the way that sort of turned out. And of course, we can increase our game mode panel here just to get a better look at what it's actually doing. So let's actually maximize on play here and take another look at it. Okay, that's pretty cool. I like the way that sort of turned out. You know, again, this is just a very quick introduction to both the CineMachine and the timeline tools inside of Unity version 2017.1. Okay, coders, that is going to do it for this video. We are going to be diving more into the CineMachine and timeline tools moving forward. Let us know if you have new features that you would like to see us cover, and we will try to create those videos for you coders. We are, of course, going to be releasing additional videos within Unity 3D and a lot of the new features within 2017.1. So I look forward to seeing all of you coders in those videos videos as well. Okay, coders, I hope that you enjoyed that video. We are constantly adding new videos here on YouTube. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It allows us to continue making great content for you coders. And if you are feeling extremely generous, please check out our Patreon account. Here are a few of our other tutorials just in case you want to keep on learning. If you become a patron of Renaissance Coders, you can get access to our source code and our project files as well. Okay, coders, that's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching.